Hey everybody, what's up? So this is going to be another movie review, and it's going to be for Star Wars Episode 2 Attack of the Clones. Now, as I said in my review for Phantom Menace, I'm going to be reviewing the Star Wars films that I have not reviewed yet in preparation for the Rise of Skywalker. And also, just like my Phantom Menace review, I'm going to be covering the pros and cons that I have with Attack of the Clones, as well as some other details about it, and then I'll give you my conclusion, but first I'll summarize the overall plot. Okay? So let's get started. So Star Wars Episode 2 Attack of the Clones, which takes place 10 years after Episode 1 The Phantom Menace, starts out with Padme returning to Coruscant to vote on the Republic's creation of their own army, which she's against, and she nearly gets assassinated, but instead her decoy is killed, and she has to go into hiding in order to, be protected until the Republic can vote on the creation of their own army. And Anakin and Obi-Wan are assigned to protect her, and then when another assassination attempt happens, they say it's safer for her to just leave Coruscant and go back to her home planet of Naboo where she'll be safer. So Anakin is tasked with protecting her, while Obi-Wan at the same time is trying to find her assassin, and also uncovers the plot revolving around the clones. So now that I've summarized the overall plot to you, let's get into first my pros with the movie. Alright, so my biggest pro with Episode 2, and what I consider to be the biggest advantage that it has over Episode 1, is first of all, the overall plot and story is much easier to follow, in the sense that from the beginning you understand what's going on. You're not confused, and you're not bogged down by all this political talk like you were in Phantom Menace. But still, that being said, the political talk and political themes are still an important part of this movie, especially with the clones and the creation of the Republic's army, and, how systems are currently leaving the Republic. And the reason the plot and story is much easier to follow is because from the opening scene you understand that Padme is under attack and that, she needs to be protected because she's a political official. And now that she's no longer Queen of Naboo, she's basically a senator. But, the senator for Naboo, she's sort of like her planet's representative in the Senate. And because of the assassination attempts, the Jedi have to try to protect her, while at the same time, deal with the fact that there's a lot of planets leaving the Republic and they need reinforcements, which comes in the scene after the opening scene when Mace Windu and all the Jedi are talking to Palpatine, and they say that, there aren't enough Jedi to protect the Republic. We're keepers of the peace, not soldiers, which is, one of the founding ideals of the Jedi, is that they're, pacifists and they don't want to fight. But what's interesting, and, the plot line that carries over into Clone Wars and into Revenge of the Sith that's set up in this movie, is how the Jedi were kind of forced into fighting in the Clone Wars because, they were essentially the Republic's protectors, like Obi-Wan says in Episode 4. So, they literally had no choice but to basically become military officials, which is completely against, their ideals and their philosophy, against their beliefs of being pacifists and anti-aggression, because, they think aggression is a path to the dark side. And I think that's one of the reasons why they ended up being destroyed in the end, because, they essentially completely forgot, their philosophy of being, pacifists and, anti-violent. And another big pro I have with the movie is that Anakin and Obi-Wan are tasked with protecting Padme while at the same time trying to find her assassin, which makes for an interesting mystery subplot, given the fact that they, catch the wrong assassin at first. At first they think it's Zam Wesell because, she, in the opening scene, tries to, kill Padme by blowing up her ship, and then later tries to kill her with those slugs. But then they catch her and, Jango kills her, kind of, opening up more intrigue as to who the real, killer, is, and who's behind the plot to assassinate Padme, because it ties into the fact that she's against creating an army for the Republic. So, she's basically, a target for political reasons, and that eventually leads Obi-Wan to find Jango on Kamino, which he goes off to that, little subplot, that's sort of his storyline for the movie, which makes him kind of a detective, which is, probably the most interesting part of the movie. But I think it would have been a little more interesting if both Anakin and Obi-Wan went to look for Jango, rather than Anakin being tasked with protecting Padme and taking her back to Naboo, because that kind of leads into their romance, which I still think is super cringy. And in fact, I consider their romance to be probably the film's biggest flaw, because it just doesn't feel like a real romance. And when I say feel, I mean that, it's not necessarily built up properly, and, it just doesn't feel like a genuine, real romance, because it's basically forced into the plot. No pun intended. But it's forced because, it just doesn't, work, because initially, in episode 1, when we first met Anakin and Padme, never once do they kind of show those feelings for each other, when this movie starts, though, it's basically Anakin who kind of has romantic feelings for her, when she really doesn't. She's trying to focus more on her political career rather than, her personal life. And that's why, their romance eventually turns into this, really, over dramatic Shakespearean thing, because of, the idea of, oh, they can't be together because they're on different paths in life. She's a politician, he's a Jedi. And one of the rules of the Jedi Order is that a Jedi can't have attachments romantically and non-romantically, because attachments lead to emotion, and too much emotion, according to the Jedi Code, leads to the dark side. But again, their romance doesn't feel real, because it feels very Shakespearean in nature and over-dramatic, and overall just feels like a romance in, some crappy high school movie. It's basically like a Hollywoodized version of romance, where it just doesn't feel real. It just feels so mushy and fake. And, for most of the movie, they're just sweet talking each other and making faces at each other, and Anakin, kind of puts on a creepy vibe when he's around her, that you can tell he basically just wants to bone her, and that's it. And she's kind of resistant to it at first, but then there's also certain scenes where he says really fucked up and creepy ass things, and she doesn't bat an eye. For example, the famous scene when they're having the picnic, in the meadow, and he talks about how he would support a dictatorship, and later on, when he says, you're exactly the way I remember you in my dreams, and really creepy shit like that, which should have raised huge red flags with Padme, and should have just made her leave him, but she doesn't. Just because of the fact that, for the sake of the plot, she has to stay with him, because her and Anakin are going to end up being, Luke and Leia's parents. So that's really the only reason that their romance is a thing in this movie, because the story demands that they have to be Luke and Leia's parents, because there really isn't any other major female characters that could be Luke and Leia's mom, so it had to be Padme, of course. And, speaking of romance in Star Wars, the reason why a lot of people, including myself, consider Han and Leia's romance to be the best romance in Star Wars is because it feels natural and develops and, changes in an organic and natural way, a realistic way, and a relatable way. And what I mean by that is that, when they first meet in New Hope, they don't get along at all. They're constantly at each other's throats and constantly bickering, and that kind of carries over into Empire Strikes Back. But through the course of Empire Strikes Back, they grow to care about each other, because they're kind of stuck in this situation together, so they're kind of forced to spend time with each other. And probably the greatest thing about Han and Leia's romance is that Han himself basically matures through it. when you meet him in A New Hope, he's just this self-absorbent asshole and kind of a narcissist. But by the end of Empire, he really matures into a selfless, caring guy. And I think that's only because, you know, Leia was the person that he didn't know he needed all along. And also, another reason why their romance works so well is because it's subtly set up in A New Hope. Like the scene where Luke and Han are talking about Leia, and Han says, you think a princess and a guy like me? And Luke's just like, no, I could not see you together. You know, that's one of the reasons why their romance works so well, is because it's subtly set up, and, you know, it doesn't happen instantly like, you know, Anakin and Padme's does. You know, with Anakin and Padme, there's absolutely no development, but with Han and Leia there is. That's why it's the superior romance. But anyway, getting back to the pros of the movie, another pro that I have is the fact that the humor of the movie is much less cartoonish and much less eye-rolling. Like, there are a couple of genuinely really funny moments, especially with Obi-Wan and Anakin's banter. Like, at the beginning of the movie, like, during the chase scene, you know, when they're chasing after Zam Wesell. And Obi-Wan's like, what took you so long? And Anakin's like, sorry, I couldn't find a speeder that I liked. Or later on, like towards the end, like, you know, during the big arena battle, when Anakin and Obi-Wan meet up again, Anakin was like, you know, I sent you a message and then we decided to come rescue you. And Obi-Wan's like, good job. You know, Obi-Wan's sarcasm is one of the funniest things about him in these movies, and in Clone Wars as well. But that does kind of lead me into another con that I have, and that is Obi-Wan and Anakin's relationship in this movie specifically. And the reason it's a con for me is because it's just not accurate to how Obi-Wan described their relationship in A New Hope. Meaning that, like, you know, in A New Hope, Obi-Wan said that him and Anakin were really close friends, that Anakin was a really honorable and cunning warrior. But in this movie, it seems like they're constantly fighting, and they're constantly, like, at each other's throats. You know, they're constantly talking about each other behind each other's backs. You know, it doesn't really feel like a natural student-teacher relationship. It feels like a very dysfunctional teacher-student relationship more than anything else. But in all fairness, you know, it wasn't the plan, you know, for Obi-Wan to train Anakin. You know, it basically just happened after Qui-Gon's death, so Obi-Wan was essentially stuck with Anakin. But the reason it doesn't work in this movie is just because they're constantly fighting with each other. You know, Anakin's extremely, you know, arrogant and disobedient, and Obi-Wan is also, like, too strict and harsh. And another pro I have with the movie is the action, which I actually like a little bit better than the action in Phantom Menace, because it's much faster and more fun, rather than kind of, like, cheesy and, you know, video game-esque in nature, and also, like, appearance. Like, you know, some of the visual effects and CGI in this movie is better than the visual effects and CGI in Phantom Menace. Like, for example, the scene where Obi-Wan and Anakin are chasing Zam Wesell through Coruscant. That's a really fun chase scene, partly because of the music, but also the pace of it. Even though the editing of that chase scene isn't the best. But overall, it just feels fun and fast-paced and kind of intense because, like, they're chasing each other through, like, tons of traffic of, like, all these ships and speeders, like, everywhere, and they're trying to dodge all those other ships. And then probably the best action scene next to the chase scene through Coruscant and the chase scene between Obi-Wan and Jango in the asteroid field, which is a nice callback to Empire and a nice similarity to Empire, even though, like, it's kind of a rip-off of the asteroid field chase from Empire. But probably the best action scene in Episode 2 is, of course, the Battle of Geonosis and the whole arena battle with all the Jedi versus the battle droids and the Geonosians. That is just amazing because it's so much bigger in scale compared to the battle scenes and action scenes in Episode 1. but also because that was the first time we got to see so many different Jedi in one place, like, fight. So in that sense, it's kind of, a big moment for the saga, because that was the first time we saw Jedi fight together, on the battlefield. And that would become a bigger thing in the Clone Wars and in Episode 3. And before I start giving you my cons for the movie, I'm going to discuss my last few pros. Firstly, some of the newer characters that are introduced in Episode 2 are pretty fun. Like, for example, Jango, who, in my opinion, is a much cooler bounty hunter than Boba because he actually gets to do more, and, is not sidelined and isn't given just a few lines. He has a super important role in the story, given the fact that he's one of the villains, but not the main villain. The twist is that Dooku is the main villain, even though the main crawl kind of explains that. So, in that sense, there's some mystery and also some not mystery. But I like Jango just because, he gets stuff done, and accomplishes his missions like an actual bounty hunter would. Even though, to be fair, Boba accomplished his mission of, finding Han and telling Vader about him. But what sucks about Boba is that, he's kind of underdeveloped in the movies just because he's only in, most of Empire and then only the first act of Jedi, and then he gets killed in such a silly way. And no, I don't believe he's alive. I don't believe he escaped the Sarlacc pit because that never happened. I don't care what you say about the EU. It never happened according to George Lucas. But anyway, no, Jango, he's a really cool new character. Dexter Jettster, he's kind of funny, even though he's just sort of there for exposition. He's just there to tell Obi-Wan where the poison dart that Jango shot at Zam Wesell came from, and that leads Obi-Wan to go to Kamino, even though it's not, in the Jedi archives. And it's implied that Dooku erased the location from the archives since Dooku was once a Jedi. That gets into another con that I have, and that is Dooku. I just don't like him as villain. He's not threatening. He's not developed well enough to be intimidating. Dooku is basically just an old guy and just, a servant to Palpatine and really has no purpose or presence beyond that. And I didn't like how he kept showing up in Clone Wars. He's just not a good villain because he's not given much development other than the fact that he mentions that he was Qui-Gon's master and so forth, and the fact that he's, the leader of the Separatists, but beyond that, you just don't learn enough about him to care about him or, be invested in him as you did with Palpatine and Vader. And another issue I have with Dooku is the scene where he talks to Obi-Wan after Obi-Wan is captured on Geonosis, and he admits to Obi-Wan that Palpatine, aka Sidious, is the one who's running the Senate, which is such a dumb moment in my opinion, because why would Dooku admit something that big? Why would he tell Obi-Wan that, Palpatine is behind this whole frickin' thing and has been from the beginning, and I know it because I'm, his apprentice? I mean, seriously. How could Dooku be that stupid to admit something that huge to Obi-Wan? Well, I mean, in the long run, it doesn't really matter since Obi-Wan doesn't believe it, but then, of course, by the time Episode 3 rolls around, he finds out for himself. But yeah, that's one of my major problems with Dooku is the fact that he admits Palpatine's the mastermind behind everything. And another con that I have with Attack of the Clones is pretty much the same one that I had with Phantom Menace, and that is the pacing and how it's just nowhere near as smooth as the original trilogy films. It's just bogged down by subplots that aren't really interesting. Even though, to be fair, the first and third act are kind of good because you can understand what's going on and you're kind of invested. The first and second act of Attack of the Clones aren't super boring because there are some interesting moments. Similar to Last Jedi, like how the second act of that movie was really bogged down by Canto Bight. But with Attack of the Clones, the second act is really bogged down by Anakin and Padme's romance because it's not interesting and it just bores you to death. And as for my other cons, some of them aren't as big as Anakin and Padme's romance. That's still my biggest con with the movie, and the reason why I like Phantom Menace a tad more still. But a couple other ones are, for example, Jar Jar being selected to take Padme's place in the Senate while she goes back to Naboo to hide. Now, granted, like I said, after rewatching episodes 1 and 2, I like Jar Jar, but to have him be a senator was arguably way more unbelievable than him being a general in episode 1, because first of all, obviously he has no political experience, and two, he does the exact opposite of what Padme wanted, and that is approve the, creation of the Republic's army by granting Palpatine emergency powers so that he can approve the use of clones and make them into the Republic army, which is exactly what, Padme was against, and the whole reason why she went back to Coruscant in the first place. She even says earlier on that, I didn't, fight for years to defeat the Military Creation Act, to not be here when fate is decided, or blah, blah, blah. So yeah, that was a really stupid decision on Jar Jar's part, but also it was a stupid decision on Padme's part to put him in charge and to take her place, when she could have easily just picked Bail Organa, because Bail Organa actually has political experience, and he is a senator and knows Padme very well, and he ends up being super important in episode 3 since he ends up being Leia's adopted father. So why couldn't she just pick Bail Organa? But overall, I would say that Attack of the Clones is an okay sequel. It's not better than the original, like how Empire was better than New Hope, and it's also, it's just not a good sequel just because it doesn't really, it's not as enjoyable as episode 1, but it does do some good things, and in general, does a good job at foreshadowing and setting up what's going to come in episode 3 and in Clone Wars, so I can praise it for that. To me, the best parts about episodes 1 and 2 are the foreshadowing and build up for things that are going to happen in Clone Wars in episode 3. But overall, the movie is really just dragged down by Anakin and Padme's romance and some of the pacing and some of the comedy and visual and special effects, and how overall, story-wise, it's just not as enjoyable as episode 1, even though the story for Attack of the Clones is much easier to follow than the story and plot for episode 1. But I still enjoy episode 1 more because at least you didn't have romance bogging down most of the movie. And so for those reasons, I will give Star Wars Episode 2 Attack of the Clones a frickin' okay, or a solid C. Oh, and by the way, before I leave, if you are a Star Wars fan and if you're sick of the haters and sick of the negativity in the fan base, feel free to join my Facebook group, All Star Wars, which I'll put a link to in the description below. Alright, see you guys later. Bye.